All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do the introduction. Thank you all for bearing with me through this technical difficulty. So today, the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab is proud to present Senior Professor Robert S. Davis. Professor Davis has built a research collection at the Wallace State Community College in Hanceville, Alabama, that pioneers promoting and teaching local and family history in the college environment. He holds a Master of Education degree in History from the University of North Georgia and a Master of Arts degree from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Bob has more than 1,250 publications on records and research, as well as various appearances on television. His work has received numerous awards, and he has spoken to hundreds of groups across the country. Today's topic is titled Blue, Gray, and Blood, Secrets to Successfully Researching Your Civil War Ancestor. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Davis.
Thank you. All right. Well, years ago, a friend of mine was giving a talk, one of his many talks, and he got around to talking about military records. And he said military records are the croutons of genealogy. They're like croutons on a salad bar. You don't really care for them, but you'd miss them if they were not there. Well, that's not true. And this talk will be centered on the Civil War, but it will also celebrate the many good things that you can find in military records and hit on some rules that are pretty good for any kind of research, not just military research. So let's go on to the next slide. That's a turkey on the left. I'm on the right. Okay, next slide. All right. Okay, military records are more than about did your ancestors serve and on which side, and whether you can join a patriotic association or not. Those are good reasons for exploring military records. Nothing wrong with joining the Daughters of the American Revolution or the Sons of Confederate Veterans, but military records and the Civil War being an excellent example serve other purposes. The next slide, please. All right, now let's talk about why military records are important. First, military records can contain information about county of birth, death, marriage, physical description, year of birth, and so much more. Now, they're not consistent in this. One record will be invaluable for your ancestor, and then the same records next time will be useless in your research. It's always a bit hit or miss. But on the other hand, information on one soldier may also apply to his siblings. For example, I once did research on a family from Alabama that no one could find the Civil War service records for. I found them, but only because they left Alabama and crossed the river to Georgia and joined the Georgia Artillery Battery. By the end of the Civil War, this father and his 7 sons had all received medical discharges from the Confederate Army. The medical discharges showed that all 8 of them were born in different counties across the South, and you could put pins on a map of the southern United States and see from that everywhere this family had been. But the point being that if you may find information on one soldier that is also valuable for the entire family. For example, you look up your ancestor's Civil War service record, you find 2 little cards that tell you next to nothing except that he served. However, when you look up his brother's service record shows that he was born in Barnwell District, South Carolina in 1838. Now, you know from the federal census records that your ancestor, his brother, was born in South Carolina in 1836. So if younger brother was born in Barnwell District in 1838, what does that tell you about where your ancestor was born in South Carolina in 1836? You see what I'm getting at. And of course, the more common your surname is, the more valuable that trick works, particularly if it's Smiths or Crawfords or Davises or Joneses. Furthermore, if all you get out of a Civil War service record is that your ancestor was in a certain county at a certain time, that can be valuable information in itself. Again, particularly when you're dealing with families with relatively common last names like Davises. The documents from Civil War records can prove your family stories, and they can also provide historical background that you never knew before about your family. For example, you could find out that your ancestor was an honor guard for the corpse of Abraham Lincoln, or that your ancestor was on the federal warship, the Monitor, or all sorts of things from the records that for some reason have not been passed down as family tradition. And when you study your ancestor and the unit that he served in and what probably were his experiences in the Civil War, then you can go out to Civil War battlefields and museums, small ones in local areas to big national ones like Gettysburg, and you could retrace your ancestors' steps in these major historical events. Again, and my own family provides a good example of this. My grandmother told me that my ancestor served in the Confederate Army. He was one of the last Confederate veterans. I checked the pension records, and that was absolutely true. What my grandmother did not know is that he had 3 brothers. One of his brothers died in his arms at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Another brother went north of the Ohio River to avoid the war, and when he came home, he found that his wife had more children than she should have, so he divorced her and took the kids he believed were his. And the youngest brother, he joined the 1st Georgia Battalion, United States Infantry, which he deserted from in order to come home to protect his elderly parents from guerrillas. So, as they say, you can learn so much. Could we go to the next slide, please? However, military records do have problems, including for the Civil War. At any given time in American history, only some 1 in 5 American males served in the military. Sometimes the men were too old, and sometimes the boys were too young. However, there were plenty of boys who lied about their age to go off to war, and many old-timers, some of them even veterans of the War of 1812, who followed the call of the bugle one more time and went off to war. The youngest recorded soldier of the American Civil War was Johnny Clements, the little drummer boy of Shiloh. He was reportedly 9 years old. When he retired from the United States Army, he was a major general. This was after the war with Spain. Unfortunately, sometimes the Civil War records do not survive. A lot of the Confederate records were lost. There were entire Confederate regiments in which not even one roster has survived. And so that can be difficult in proving that your ancestors served at all, much less what he did during the war. And then sometimes the records are extremely difficult to find, but we'll talk about some of the more exotic records later. The handouts that I gave you point to many of these exotic sources, and you can spend a pretty good amount of time going through every indexed resource that's available looking for information on your Civil War ancestor. But it can be extremely rewarding. One other problem military records have, rarely and usually only in pension records, do you find some information on possible parents. At a Confederate service record, you will find where a father or a widowed mother will petition for whatever money the Confederacy still owed her son at the time he died. In federal Civil War pensions, if a soldier did not come home, the federal government gave a pension to his parents to make up for the loss. But those records are very rare indeed. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right, now there are certain rules about using military records, and these are pretty good rules for doing genealogical research in general. First, presume nothing. You've got this fabulous story that your ancestor rode with Colonel Custer in the Civil War, or you've got some story, like in my family, that my ancestor saved Robert E. Lee's telescope at the Battle of Malvern Hill, and we still celebrate that in this family. Presume nothing to be true or false. Some of the strangest stories that I've heard from the Civil War prove to be true. But what you do is document everything, prove everything, and record everything. One of the saddest sounds to ever hear is somebody talking about, well, I've got this page of documents, and I don't know where it came from, but it's critically important to my research. I have people who come here all the time, and they think that somehow I can magically look on a piece of paper and tell them the microfilm reel number and the source of the document. And sometimes I can do that, but don't you be one of those people. You record everything, the full citation of everything that you find. And anything that looks the least bit interesting, copy it and copy the citation to it. Believe me, if you don't do that, whatever it is you thought was interesting, the next week, you're going to discover that the continuation of Western civilization is going to depend on you finding that document again, and you're not going to be able to do it. Now, one of the big problems of military records, everybody falsely presumes that everything that has survived is at the National Archives in Washington. The National Archives in Washington has fabulous collections, but they do not have everything. In any war, when you're looking for the records of your ancestors' military service, check at the appropriate state archives. Also check at the appropriate public libraries. They have all sorts of resources that are not at the National Archives. And in the case of Civil War soldiers, even Northern Civil War soldiers, sometimes information is found at local public libraries or in state archives that you're not going to find at the National Archives. Use relevant histories of battles, leaders, and places. Look at sources cited in footnotes. Now, this is what the serious genealogist does. For example, you know that your ancestor was in the 31st Alabama, and you know that the 31st Alabama was at the Battle of Chancellorsville. And you're reading histories of the Battle of Chancellorsville, and you look in the index, and lo and behold, you find references to the 31st Alabama, or to the brigade or the division that the 31st was in. You go to the footnotes in that book, and it tells you about letters and diaries and memoirs of soldiers who were in the 31st or were in the same brigade. And those letters and diaries and memoirs can tell you what your ancestors saw when your ancestor was there. Now, this applies to any scholarly work, not just to work on the Civil War. There's a county in Georgia, Hancock County, and for some reason, all these scholars did all this research on Hancock County over the years, and they did all these dissertations and histories, and they're wonderful. But you go to the footnotes of those histories, and you find diaries and letters and papers that could relate to your ancestor. I have had people go through Civil War books and actually find letters of their ancestor they never knew existed, or a diary or a memoir they never knew existed of their ancestor. But I tell you this, even if you never find diaries or letters or memoirs of your Civil War ancestor, would not such documents from somebody in the same company or the same regiment or the same battery be almost as good? All right, also understand that civilians always have Civil War experiences and also have military experiences as well. And in your handouts, there are references made to special records at the National Archives, and there'll be similar records at state archives of civilians working for one side or the other in the Civil War and their experiences as well. And of course, civilians also leave diaries and letters and memoirs, all the more reason to contact the local public library. Remember that artifacts and photographs are records too. I've had people bring me old photographs, and they were just absolutely shocked at what the photograph told us. Or artifacts, somebody came to me one time with a helmet and said that their ancestor wore it in the American Civil War. I said, no, they wore it in the First World War. So, like I said, artifacts and photographs and things of this sort, they are valuable information sources too. Let's look at the next slide, please. All right, now before you set off to find your Johnny Reb or your Billy Yank in the American Civil War, there's some basics about the Civil War that you should know. First off, the American Civil War was fought between April of 1861 and April of 1865. There was a classic book called Across 5 Aprils, which was a novel about the Civil War. 11 of the states of the United States withdrew from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. The remaining states of the United States banded together and brought them back into the Union. That's why the best name for this conflict is a war between the states. However, the American historians voted a long time ago that we were going to call it the Civil War instead. The campaigns in the American Civil War were fought in three theaters. The eastern seaboard states, from South Carolina to Pennsylvania, were called the Eastern Theater. The states west of those states to the Mississippi River were called the Western Theater. And the states across the Mississippi River were called the Trans-Mississippi West. During the Civil War, the Union Army had some 4 million soldiers, and the Confederacy had some 1.4 million soldiers. We do not know the exact numbers because not all the records have survived. Genealogically valuable records also exist from the years after the Civil War, in the period called Reconstruction that came out of the Civil War. We'll talk more about those in a moment. And the same Civil War records, Confederate and Union, survive for African Americans, for immigrants, and for Native Americans as for any other soldiers. The sole exception would be African Americans who served in the Confederate Army. They were only allowed to get Confederate pensions if they resided in South Carolina or Tennessee. Could we look at the next slide, please? And this better illustrates, if you would, the territory of the Civil War. There's much more that could be said about the Civil War. You might be surprised to learn that the state of Arizona was an invention of the Confederate government, or that California tried to secede from the Union, or that Illinois would have seceded from the war, except for some dirty tricks pulled by Abraham Lincoln. It was a very strange war, and it is almost sometimes incomprehensible. Could we look at the next slide, please? All right, there's several good books out there for Civil War research, and we have some of them here, some that are listed, but there are many others. There are many others out there as well. The best general history of the Civil War, not for specific genealogical research, but to understand the war, is James McPherson's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Battle Cry of Freedom. Next slide, please. The next slide, please. Very good. All right, there are also many sites on the... Oh, back one, please. Back one, please.
Oh, hold on.
All right. There we go, yes. All right, the internet is just a huge blessing for doing Civil War research. There are all sorts of sites about battles, campaigns, subjects, units. The Manhattan Beach Middle School provides us with a list of the major sites. Also, believe it or not, there are actually printed books out there on refighting the Civil War on the internet. We're finding these sites on the internet. Most of these sites are free. And you can find the best stuff on them. These include FamilySearch.org, which is a genealogy site, and the Library of Congress's collections. The Library of Congress has an excellent collection of Civil War maps online, Civil War photographs online, and many Civil War newspapers online. Now, many of the subscription sites are great for the Civil War, and I think particularly of Ancestry.com and Fold3.com. Now, if you're not ready to invest in either of those yet, then I recommend visiting a public library when this virus is over. Visiting a public library, many public libraries have Ancestry and Fold3 available free for use by people visiting the library. For the next slide, please. Yeah, very good. All right. Now, there are basically two types of Civil War researchers. Most of us are only trying to prove that Grandpa was in the Civil War and on which side, and maybe try to join a patriotic organization associated with the Civil War. Then there are those people who want to go further, much further. Those are the kind of people who end up writing regimental histories or Civil War biographies or publishing memoirs. Nothing wrong with either group. Nothing is wrong with either group. Now, the people who are just looking for the basic information on their soldier, they are looking for two things. One is the service record, and the other is the pension record. To join a patriotic Civil War group, all you need is the pension record, but if you can get the service record, that works as well, too. Now, the National Archives has over 3 million pension applications filed by Union veterans or their survivors from the Civil War. And there's an index to the federal pensions on Ancestry.com and Fold3.com. And these pension files can be a goldmine of information. But usually, when a pension application was sent to Washington, the first thing they did in Washington was look up the soldier's service record and include a copy of the service record in the pension file. Now, as what we're looking at here, this is actually President James A. Garfield. President James A. Garfield. As you remember, he was a president of the United States who was assassinated. He was a colonel in the 42nd Ohio Infantry. He ended the war as a major general, and later he becomes president of the United States. His widow actually applied for a federal pension as a widow. By 1900, 40% of the United States budget was going to pay for federal Civil War pensions. All right, can we go to the next slide, please? All right, now the Civil War service records are widely available. Now, the National Archives has millions of Civil War service records for Union and for Confederate soldiers and of all races. Many Confederate records, however, did not survive to become part of the service records. The best indexes to Civil War service records are on the subscription site Ancestry.com, but there's also a free site by the National Park Service called Soldiers and Sailors Database. The Broadfoot Company has published a roster of the Confederate soldiers based on National Archives microfilm and of federal soldiers based on National Archives microfilm in book form. Now, understand that the National Archives, as I said, does not have everything. Many individual state archives have records of Civil War service that are not at the National Archives. This is particularly true of the Confederate states. Many of the Confederate states that have Confederate service records where they've not survived to make it to the National Archives. One of the saddest stories I ever heard was of General Robert E. Lee at his retreat to Appomattox. He ordered all the records of his army put in wagons and rescued from Richmond to guarantee that the service of his brave soldiers would be remembered for all time. The mule skinners saw federal cavalry coming, so they released their mules and then they set fire to their wagons. Robert E. Lee and his staff rode up just in time to see the records in flames, and it broke his heart. Now, for the northern states, most of the northern states published Civil War service records of their soldiers in what were called the Adjutant General's reports. And each northern state has these reports for their particular state. And sometimes you can find names and information in the Adjutant General's reports when you will not find that information at the National Archives. Now, if your ancestor joined the regular United States Army, not the volunteers, which was most of the Union Army during the Civil War, but the regular United States Army, then they show up, their service record is in a thing called the Register of Enlistments in the U.S. Army, 1798 to 1914. And this is scanned on the subscription site Ancestry.com. Now, this record is invaluable, not just for the Civil War, but for a lot of other conflicts as well. For almost every soldier, it gives you their county and state of birth, their age, their physical description, and their military service, and how that military service ended, including for the regular United States Army during the American Civil War. Oh, and by the way, Confederates who later joined the Union Army, they have federal service records as well as Confederate service records. Could we see the next slide? All right. Now, one of the most confusing aspects of Civil War research are pensions. And what you need to understand is that the federal pensions were handled completely differently from how the Confederate pensions were handled. The United States government gave pensions to crippled and impoverished veterans of the United States military, including African Americans and Confederate soldiers who joined the federal military. The United States government also gave money to survivors. You could get a federal Civil War pension if you were the father or mother of a deceased Union soldier or sailor, if you were the widow of a deceased Union soldier or sailor, or you were the orphan under age 21 of a deceased Union soldier and sailor. And of course, there was a great deal of pension fraud as well, and the nation's first investigative agency was the U.S. Pension Bureau. They solved more cold cases than any law enforcement agency or investigative agency in the history of the world, because all these women filed for pensions claiming that their husbands were probably dead and that they should be entitled to a pension. So the Pension Bureau would actually send investigators out into the country to try to find out what happened to their husbands. And all of this will be in a federal Civil War pension pile. The individual states and the United States government also operated homes for Civil War veterans and widows of veterans, including, believe it or not, in many cases for Confederate veterans. That is, you could be a Confederate veteran and be welcomed at the Indiana Civil War Veterans Home. And we also have a link here to take you to burials in the National Cemetery, which included many of the Civil War soldiers. Okay, and important fact that's kind of obvious to nobody but me. The federal Civil War pensions are kept at the National Archives on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. You can go to the National Archives website and you can order a copy of the pension. Whenever you're ordering a military pension from the National Archives, always order every page if you can. Most of the pages in a Civil War pension are just bureaucratic junk, but occasionally buried inside such a pension file, there's some nugget that would be overlooked if somebody were just skimming through it. I had an ancestor who served 2 years in the Confederate cavalry. Then he and his entire company defected to the Union Army. When he died in a hospital in Indiana, his widow qualified for a federal Civil War pension. Everybody in the family had a copy of her United States pension. But when I was at the National Archives, I ordered the actual file, and lo and behold, I discovered written on the outside of the file folder her date and place of death, which none of us in the family had ever known. But, of course, nobody would have thought to have copied the outside of the file folder. Let's look at the next slide. As I said, federal pensions, even those given to Confederate defectors, are at the National Archives of Washington. Now, the 11 states that seceded from the Union, plus the states of Kentucky, Missouri, and Oklahoma, all also gave pensions to Confederate veterans and to widows of Confederate veterans. But each of these 14 states that gave Confederate pensions did it in their own warm and wonderfully wacky way. There was no consistency in this at all. South Carolina, as usual, had the worst records. Alabama, as usual, has the best records. And Georgia, as usual, is somewhere in between. But that gives you some idea of what it's like. Now, the pensions were given to resident Confederate veterans and resident widows of Confederate veterans. Your ancestor served in the 2nd South Carolina Heavy Artillery, but as an old man, he lives in Texas. It'll be the state of Texas that gives him his pension. Your ancestor served in the 2nd Florida Cavalry, but his widow lives in Georgia. His widow will get her pension from the state of Georgia, not the state of Florida. Now, there was one exception to this residency rule. If the veteran or the widow lived in a state that did not give Confederate pensions, then the state where the soldier had served would mail a pension to the appropriate party. For example, your ancestor served in the 5th Tennessee Confederate Infantry, but his widow lives in Oregon after the war. Oregon did not give Confederate pensions, but the state of Tennessee would have mailed her a pension because he served in a Tennessee unit. Okay. Now, the same thing goes for Confederate soldiers' homes. The Confederate soldiers' homes were ran by the individual southern states, and you have to go to the state archives, just as you do for the Confederate pensions. You also have to go to the state archives to check on records of the Confederate soldiers' home. Oddly enough, the only state that I think has published their Confederate soldiers' home records is the state of Georgia. Ted Brooks' book, Into the Gray Veil. In some states, individuals have published records of Confederate burials within their state, particularly Georgia, Mississippi, and Virginia. But not every southern state has done that. And for both sides in the American Civil War, often soldiers died and were buried in unmarked graves with no identification. They just disappeared into the smoke. Let's look at the next slide. Now, many sources are available at the National Archives, the individual state archives, university archives, and other sources for the Civil War. Now, as I say, sometimes you may not find the information cataloged or indexed under your ancestor's name. Sometimes you find what you want cataloged or indexed under the designation of the unit. The 55th Pennsylvania, the 2nd Minnesota, the 3rd Louisiana, something of that sort. So once you know your ancestor's unit, check all of these sources by unit. Also, and this is again a trick that applies to all genealogical research, whenever you're dealing with a library or an archives and you're checking their finding aids, their indexes, their catalogs, whatever, always check for the geographic locations important to your research. Because sometimes there are letters and diaries and store account books and you name it that are only cataloged under the name of the geographic location, not under the thousands of individuals who could be mentioned within that document. So the good researcher always checks the catalogs for where their ancestor came from, and the good military records researcher always checks for the unit, Now, here are some sites that you can make these searches on. Amazon.com. You might want to look up the battles. You might want to even look up the regiment that your ancestors served in. Archive Grid. It is wonderful for finding manuscript collections in libraries and archives across this country. You can type in the 31st Alabama, and then you find these wonderful papers and letters at the Alabama Archives or at Tulane University or at Harvard University. I did this on my ancestors' unit at 23rd Georgia, and I discovered, and they counted this as a document, that his company flag is today at the Chicago Historical Society. Quite interesting story about how that happened. And of course, there's nothing wrong with Googling something. Google your ancestor, Google his regiment, Google the important facts about him. Hathi Trust is wonderful for having scanned in millions of books. And on Hathi Trust, you can search those books, do word searches to those books for names and regiments and battles and whatever interests you. The Library of Congress has done much the same. There's a list of all the different newspapers that have been scanned. Some of these places, like the newspaper archives for California, for Georgia, those are free to the public. The Library of Congress has a free newspaper search website called Chronicling America. Others, however, like newspapers.com and newspaperarchive.com, they're subscription sites that you must subscribe to, or you can go to a library that has a subscription to it, and at that library you can then use it for free. And WorldCat is just wonderful. WorldCat, you search on WorldCat for a book, and WorldCat will tell you the libraries that are members of it that have that book and how many miles away you are. This is something that is greater value than just the Civil War or just military records. This is a great way to find out where the nearest library is that has that rare family history that you need, or that rare local history that you need. And even find out if, like the Mid-Continent Library in Independence, Missouri, they will actually loan you the book on microfilm. On interlibrary loan, I beg your pardon. Let's go to the next frame. However, the greatest repository for general information from the Civil War on individuals, on units, on battles, campaigns, the rest of it, is the National Archives and Records Administration. At the end of the Civil War, the United States government had most of its Civil War records, and they sent soldiers across the South to seize all the Confederate records that they could. They did not find everything, but they did find a lot. And starting in the 1880s, the War Department began organizing and cataloging these records and indexing these records for our use. Our National Archives has excellent guides to using its resources, and I list the best of these for the Civil War on your screen on this slide, particularly the books by Henry Putney Beers. What Beers does is going through his book. I don't recommend using the index. I recommend going through it page by page. But you go through his books page by page. He tells you what records you need to look at the National Archives. But if he could find out about other records at other libraries and archives, he mentions those in his books too. So it's not just the National Archives. It is the whole country is included in the Beers books. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, now these are some of the records that are at the National Archives, and I don't mean to brag, but we also have all of these microfilms in our collection here at Wallace State in Hanceville, Alabama. Letters received by the Confederate Adjutant General and by the Secretary of War. These could be letters by soldiers, these could be letters by civilians. Often they contain personal information. Could you get me a promotion? I know the following important people. We have not heard from our father in 6 months, and we are scared that something has happened to him. Could you have somebody check on him? Dear sir, I would like to recommend this soldier for the Medal of Honor for his bravery at the Battle of you fill in the blank. The Union Provost Marshal's files. The Federal Provost Marshal investigated crime and criminals north and south during the Civil War. And some of the most amazing documents of the Civil War are in the Provost Marshal's files. And these files are thoroughly indexed by every name. So you can find your ancestor on a list, at the bottom of a huge list in one of the documents sent in to the Provost Marshal. The National Archives has records of the Confederate and Union prisoners of war, and many of these are copied onto Ancestry.com. Not absolutely everything, but the most important of these records are scanned and indexed on Ancestry.com. The Confederacy had files on every private individual and every company that did business with the Confederacy, and these are called the Citizens Files. And the Citizens Files have also been indexed and scanned on Fold3.com. And these records can be, again, absolutely incredible. For example, you might find out that your ancestor from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, was a messenger for the Selma Arsenal. And you're saying to yourself, what is a messenger? Well, you look it up in one of the Civil War guidebooks, and you discover that a messenger's job was to make sure that trainloads of explosives got to the Army. And any time that railroad tried to get disconnect the cars in order to carry more profitable cargo, it was the job of the messenger to shoot the railroad conductor, as an example, and then force the engineer to continue on to the Army with the trainloads of supplies. I'm sure that measures just as drastic were necessary in the Union as well. Then there are the unfiled papers and slips, and these are a real gold mine. When the War Department was putting together the Confederate records, frequently they found records of Confederate soldiers, but they could not match the soldier up to a regiment. The unfiled papers and slips are alphabetical records, alphabetically arranged records of Confederate soldiers where the record could not be matched to a soldier's service record. And of course, there are hundreds and hundreds of Confederate soldiers in those records for whom there are no compiled service records because these unfiled papers and slips were the only record of that Confederate soldier's service. And an excellent source. And again, on the subscription site, Fold 3. Could we go to the next slide, please? Okay, now, one of the important things about doing Civil War research is to discover what unit or units your ancestor served in. Sometimes all you get from a compiled service record is a couple of cards that really don't tell you anything more than your ancestor was in that unit at a certain time. If that's all you've got, well, whether that's all you've got or not, you need, if your ancestor served in the United States military, you need to check Frederick H. Dyer's Compendium of the War of the Rebellion. Dyer was a Civil War veteran. He worked for over 40 years putting these together. And they're individual histories of each federal Civil War regiment, except for the guerrillas. And you can take the information from Dyer's compendium, and you can get a pretty good idea of what your ancestor, where your ancestor served, and what your ancestor experienced. For the Confederacy, we have two sources: Joseph H. Crute's Units of the Confederate States Army and Stuart Sefakis's Compendium of the Confederate Armies. They do not duplicate each other very much, believe it or not. So if you're looking for a specific Confederate unit, look up that unit in both of these sources. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Now, some people will argue that the Civil War began before Fort Sumter was fired upon. And some people will also argue that the war lasted considerably longer than Fort Sumter, than Appomattox. And I'm not going to argue with either school of thought. But there are a lot of records that came out of the Civil War that were created after the Civil War that can be a gold mine for genealogical family research. Among these are the Civil War claims. Now, the most famous of these claims were the Southern Claims Commission records, and these are wonderful. These were claims filed by Southerners who said they did not support the Confederacy, but they lost property to the United States military. And you could be black as well as white and file these claims. And there is a list of them published by Gary Mills as Southern Loyalists in the Civil War. If you contact the National Archives and ask them to check Record Group 56, Entry 366, that is a monster index to all the Civil War claims, not just the Southern Unionist claims. And you can have them check there to see if your ancestor, North or South, filed a claim after the Civil War for property unjustly taken from them. Now, I should mention that 80% of the claims filed by Southerners were rejected by the United States because either the Southerners failed to prove their support for the Union or they failed to prove that their property was lost to the Union Army. Other records, there's some 14 categories where if you were a Southerner, say you were a Confederate postmaster or you were a Confederate officer or you were a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, where you could not just take an oath to the United States government and we're all good, what the Confederate soldiers referred to as swallowing the cat. But there are 14 classes of people who had to petition the President of the United States, and after that to petition the governor of their state, then petition the President of the United States for a pardon. After 1868, most of these people were freed from this obligation. But these applications for pardons, which are available on Fold 3, can be a gold mine of personal information. My ancestor included in his physical description, which we had never had before. And I've seen other wonderful things in these applications for pardons. The records of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. These are on Ancestry.com, and these are a fabulous source of information, not just on the African Americans, but sometimes on the white people that they dealt with as well, and should certainly be looked at. Then there is the Freedmen's Bank. Now, the Freedmen's Bank was different from the Freedmen's Bureau. This is where African Americans and immigrants, white immigrants like the Irish, were encouraged to deposit money and develop thrifty banking habits. The Freedmen's Bank, because the former slaves did not have a great deal of personal identification, they had to give detailed information on their lives to prove that this was their account. For example, they had to name their masters, they had to name their parents, their brothers and sisters, their wives, their children, all this stuff. I one time reconstructed an African American family for 5 generations based on what they put on their deposit cards with the Freedmen's Bank. But what survives of the Freedmen's Bank records are on the free website FamilySearch.org. Many state archives also have records for the period of Reconstruction that are particular to their state, such as state census records, state voter registrations, and other related records. Could we see the next slide, please? Now, you've got all this wonderful information. You've studied your ancestor's unit. You know the battles and campaigns he fought in. You found the letters and diaries of people who were in his regiment. Maybe you've got some artifacts or some letters from your ancestor himself or other family members. You know where your ancestor served and what happened. Wonderful. Now let's go out and visit the actual historic sites. Now, the national parks related to the Civil War all have computer databases of soldiers who served there. They have computer databases that will show you the movements of the individual units during the battle or during the campaign. But don't overlook local museums and battlefields and historic sites as well. These are also a great way of enjoying some of the experience that your ancestor had during the Civil War. Next slide, please. Now, much more can be said about researching a Civil War ancestor. If you contact me and here's my email address, robert.davis@wallacestate.edu, I'll send you back an attachment with detailed handouts on Confederate and Union records. I'll also be happy to answer your questions as far as I can. Now, do we have some questions from the audience?
Okay, hold on one second. Let me stop sharing the screen, and I'll switch back over to the chat room here. Hold on. Okay, let's see here. Let me open up that chat room. Robert, can you still hear me?
Oh, yes, ma'am, just fine.
Oh, great. Okay, hold on. Let's see here.
I can see you, too.
Oh, excellent. Okay, excellent. Okay, it looks like I'm still waiting for people to chime in on the chat room. So everyone, please feel free to send your questions right now through the chat room. And in the meantime, while they're doing that, I have a couple things I wanted to ask you as well. For a couple years now, I've been getting your emails, your newsletter. Do you want to tell my class a little bit about your newsletter and the value of it?
All right. I was doing this long before I'd ever heard the word internet and computers, and so I've sort of slid into this. I was hired at Wallace State to create this genealogical research lab with all the wonderful materials. We were the first outfit on the college to have a computer and the first to have an internet connection. And when I first had email, I began sending out, people started writing to me and saying, instead of mailing us your newsletter, could you send it to me as an email? So I had to find out what email was, and that's where the newsletter has begun. Now, at the address I just gave you, robert.davis@wallacestate, one word, .edu, contact me and I'll be happy to send you our blog. It includes information on local meetings. It includes ideas on research. It sometimes includes my ramblings and my ideas. Sometimes people send me questions, and I answer them for everybody on my newsletter. It's a little rough. It does not come out on a regular basis. It comes out when I have the time and I have something to say, and I have meetings to announce. To announce. But anyway, it's free, and don't worry, I do not share my email list with anybody. We're not like Bertha's Kitty Boutique, where send off for anybody's catalog, and you'll get ours too. Nothing like that.
Well, I would encourage all my students to reach out and subscribe to your free newsletter, because I really enjoy it. Like I said, I've been following your newsletter for a couple of years, and because I'm very, very interested, because I have Civil War ancestors on both sides of my parents' families, I find it incredibly helpful. And I have actually used it to help some of my students in the past. So I hope everybody will do that. And then also, we do have a couple people who asked some questions. Let's see here. Hold on. Monica out in our audience in the classroom, she's asked, do you know of any good resources to find information on female nurses who served active duty during the Civil War?
In the last few years, there have been some excellent books on Civil War nurses. And there are also some old classic books about Civil War hospitals, and the nurses are just part of it. Now, finding information on specific Civil War nurse can be very difficult unless she left memoirs or something of that sort. Often what survives of the hospital records are not the administrative part of it, but the names of the wounded and sick soldiers, things of that sort. Although the Alabama Department of Archives and History has a considerable amount of administrative records of the Alabama hospitals. In the Confederate Army, each state had its own separate hospitals that each state supported. And so if you're lucky enough to find records like that, but check on Amazon and type in Civil War nurses or Civil War hospitals, that should get you where you need to go. And again, always check the footnotes in the bibliography, because even if the book does not have something that relates directly to who you're looking for, maybe the sources cited can steer you in the right direction.
I'd like to add something to that. I actually do have a Civil War nurse in my ancestry, and I actually found her personal papers in the State Archives of California, because after the Civil War, she ended up going to California because she was related to the governor who was at the time the governor of California, and he was sick, and she was actually taking care of him until the end of his life. And she did actually form several charitable organizations in the San Francisco area. And so I found an incredible amount of information on her in the California State Archives. So, you know, there's plenty of places to look for Civil War ancestor nurses as well.
And if you use Archive Grid, if you use that free website, Archive Grid, you find papers like that. And you're absolutely right. California has an excellent archives.
Yeah, actually, you know what, Robert? I think I actually did find her papers first by going through Archive Grid, which directed me to San Francisco. So I think I'm right on that. It's been a couple of years since I did that research, but I'm pretty sure that's how I found it. Now, you mentioned earlier in your presentation that wives and parents could apply for pensions. Could both apply for a pension? In other words, let's say the soldier who had passed away during the war left a wife and parents. Could both of them apply? Could there be two separate applications?
Yes. I'm sorry, that's a question that doesn't require much description. The answer is yes. The parents could, and so could the widow. And so could, if you wanted to add to it, so could the orphans. So you could actually have, 1, 2, 3 sets of pension applications. One for the orphans, one for the widow, and one for the parents. And they could all be getting pension.
That's excellent to know. That's very, very good to know, because I actually do have my widow's pension, but I never thought to look for the parents. So I definitely will go back and do a second sweep on that as well. Now, Did the pensions end on a particular year? For instance, I have a Civil War ancestor who died in 1930, and his son lived to be until 1954. Was there a cutoff time for children to apply for a pension?
Well, there was a cutoff time for when a child could get a pension. If a soldier died in battle, his children only got pensions until they were 21. And so, maybe you could sue in court or something if you could say, well, I should have gotten a pension, but I didn't know to apply. So maybe there were cases of that. But children stopped getting pensions when they were 21. Now, the veterans, their widows, and presumably the parents, there was no end to how long they would be getting their pension other than death. I think the last federal Civil War pensioner was in the 1940s. And my ancestor was still getting he was one of the first Georgia Confederate pensioners. He was still getting his pension at the time he died on his 98th birthday in 1938. So as long as the widow was still alive and did not remarry, as long as the veteran was still alive, they drew pension.
Wonderful. Okay, that's great to know. Okay, one of our students, Connie, has asked, years ago I visited Andersonville, and at the time they were looking into recreating a portion of the camp. Number one, have they? And number two, I found a headstone of an ancestor there, but also found his burial in Illinois. Was that the norm for the day?
Okay, to answer your first question, yes. And in fact, not only have they reconstructed a very small part of the prison camp, but they now have a National Prisoner of War Museum there, in addition to the museum dedicated to Andersonville Prison. Andersonville is just an incredible experience. I've written 2 books on it. Check them out from your local public library for yourself. Now, to the second part of the question, there was an awful lot that went on with the Andersonville Confederate Federal Cemetery, the cemetery at Andersonville, which, by the way, is still an active federal cemetery even to this day. United States veterans and their wives can be buried there even now. Okay, but there are stories, and no one can document these, that in some instances families came to Andersonville and took back home the bodies of their relatives. Nobody knows if that really happened, but that's a story. Then on the other hand, it's like that federal captain who dies at the Battle of Shiloh in the movie Shenandoah. The family never recovered the body, but they put up a tombstone anyway. So it's possible he's still at Andersonville, but the family put up a tombstone as a memorial to him in their home, just like they would have if he had come home from the war. Also, there's another thing about Andersonville. There's a huge amount of fraud that went on with the prisoners for a variety of reasons. And I'm not criticizing the prisoners in any way. If I had been a prisoner there, I would have done whatever it took to get a second ration or whatever. So sometimes soldiers took the identity of soldiers who had been exchanged or soldiers who were dead and kept the name. You see, the camp was fed in 2 halves each day. So if you could get fed in the first half, then switch identities and get fed in the second half, then so much the better for you. So the tombstones and such at the cemetery, it may have been some other soldier using your ancestor's name who is buried at Andersonville. That's not impossible. I'm sorry that it came out so complicated, but it was complicated.
I think that's a wonderful answer. I think that's, pretty much covers, what could be the possibilities. Now, Pat, another one of the students was asking, I am trying to find information about an ancestor who died at the Battle of Saltville. It looks like Saltville, Saltvile, supposedly, but can't find anything. Any suggestions?
You mean the Battle of Saltville, which I believe was in Virginia, the Battle of Saltville. First, check at the local public library closest to Saltville. Ask them if they have cemetery records, they have histories, they have anything there that might be able to help you. Also, check for a pension. as you pointed out, maybe his parents, maybe his widow, maybe his children applied for a pension, and there'll be more information. If the information you're seeking is not in his service record, now was he on? If he was, now I'm talking about if he's on the federal side. Now the Confederate side, things are going to be so much worse. But if it's on the federal side, check for a federal pension. There may be information there. Of course, if he's on the Confederate side, check for a Confederate pension for his widow. What you may have to do is try to find diaries and memoirs, as I say, letters of men who were in his unit who might have mentioned his passing or being at that battle or what happened. And of course, there are books that do describe the Battle of Saltville. One time I had a friend who was publishing some Confederate letters. Only problem was the man who died, he just stopped writing the letters and the family had no idea what happened to him. So anyway, she said, your ancestor was in the same unit. Do you have anything? And I said, yes. He left me memoirs of his 3 years in Robert E. Lee's Army. It's 1.5 pages long, typed, double-spaced. She said, could I see it? So I Xeroxed it and sent it to her. I hadn't seen it in years. And she calls me up, and she's so excited she can hardly talk. And I said, what's wrong? And she said, in that memoir, it talks about Lieutenant Thomas Forrester. It said that they were standing around, and he caught a cannonball. And they scraped up what was left of him in a sack and buried it. She said, now I know what happened to him. He died at Petersburg. No more letters, of course.
Oh. Okay, now Tracy's asking, my great-grandfather was at Camp Douglas in Illinois. Can you suggest a good book about that place?
All right, there's been a book that came out just in the last year on Camp Douglas, but there was one a few years before that is a classic. It's called To Die in Chicago.
Okay. Any others that you suggest?
Just go to Amazon and type in Camp Douglas and Civil War, and all these books will come up. But the one I particularly recommend is To Die in Chicago.
Wonderful. Monica's also asking, I have 2 ancestors who died in action during the war. I can't locate where they are buried. I did contact the national cemeteries near where they died with no luck. I purchased their service records, but nothing still. Do you have any suggestions?
Okay, again, the difference is going to be whether they were Union or Confederate. In the Union, of course, you could check their service records to see when they stopped serving and why it was listed. You might want to check the service records also for hospital records. Just because they disappeared doesn't mean that they died in battle. Most of the Civil War soldiers died of disease, which means they probably died at home or they died in a hospital. If it's a Confederate soldier, again, you can check the service records. Also check the unfiled papers and slips records for him, but it may be a tough road to plow. As I said, many of these soldiers just marched into the smoke and they never came back. And nobody ever found the body, they found the body, but they weren't able to identify it afterwards, particularly if they were Confederate soldiers. The Union Army had a habit of just digging a mass grave and throwing all the rebel bodies into it.
Monica also asked, are there any lists that show which soldiers were enrolled under an alias?
What was that question again, please?
Are there any lists that show which soldiers were enrolled under an alias?
No, that was the whole reason for enrolling under an alias, was so that the government would not know. Both sides had the soldiers who would enlist, collect bounty money for enlisting. Then at the first opportunity, they would desert and then re-enlist under another name. As a consequence, again, you can't trust the names that appear on the Andersonville death roll. And in fact, of the 5 men who were hanged by their comrades at Andersonville for robbing and raiding the other prisoners, a friend of mine has just published a great book on the Andersonville raiders and their trial, and she's had a devil of a time trying to find out who they really were. because there were so many people under aliases. Let me also mention, as far as Andersonville is concerned, I also believe that some of the soldiers deliberately lied about their names because they wanted their families to believe they died in battle somewhere and that they died quickly, and they didn't want their families to know that they had long, slow deaths at Andersonville. I honestly believe that. And I've got numbers, statistics that somewhat back that up.
That's something I hadn't thought of. Wow, that's amazing.
Oh, and I might throw in some people signed up under aliases because they did not want the law to catch them from what they were doing before they enlisted. And apparently some 400 women during the Civil War enlisted under aliases and pretended to be men in order to enlist in the military.
Wow. Are there any books on that topic?
Yes, there are. There's one by Deanne Blanton about women soldiers of the Civil War in particular, but there have been others that have been published too. Again, go to Amazon, type in Women Civil War, and these books will come up. I would particularly recommend the Deanne Blanton book on that. But anyway, I don't believe that they pulled this off without the guys in their regiment knowing that they weren't women. But it did happen. It did happen. And of course, during the Civil War, as in old times, there were also men who dressed as women because they preferred to be women to being men. And of course, during the Civil War, some men did that to stay out of the war.
Well, since we're talking about aliases, can you kind of talk to the class a little bit about how people during the Civil War volunteered to take other people's places for a fee?
Yes, that happened on both sides. You could pay a fee to someone and they would go if you were drafted into the military, and both sides had a draft, but you're drafted into the military, you could pay someone to substitute for you. Of course, some people took the money you paid them to enlist to go in their place, and then they later deserted, in which case you had to serve in the Army, or you had to pay someone again to take your place. So that went on. There was similar situation in the South. Any plantation that had 20 slaves could grant a one draft exemption to a white man to manage the slaves, to work as an overseer. And since most of the Southerners did not own slaves, most of the Southerners believed they were defending their homes. They were not defending slavery. You can imagine how that went over. I'm being drafted into the Army of the Confederacy to fight and die for somebody else's right to own other human beings. And this accounted for such huge desertions among the Confederate soldiers. And that's why I find it somewhat particularly offensive that people are tearing down their monuments now. Of course, on the other hand, for all I know, if they came back to the 21st century, they'd be helping us tear them down. But, yeah. But okay. This happened on both sides. President Theodore Roosevelt's father paid someone to go in his place. President Grover Cleveland paid someone to go in his place. And unlike some politicians, Grover Cleveland was wonderful. When this was brought out, he stood up there and fully admitted to it. He said he was an orphan. He had to support his widowed mother and siblings. He said if he joined the Army, they would starve to death. So he said he paid someone to go in his place so he could stay behind and support his mother and siblings. And he said he would do it again. And he said, if that bothers you, well, that will have to bother you. But he said he wouldn't. He said that he would not hesitate to do it again. Not hesitate to do it again. But there were many people who did this.
Is there a place where one could go to find a list of those names? You know, the person who was drafted versus the person who took his place?
No. You can go to the service record, and sometimes in the service record, or sometimes in a soldier's pension, the soldier will mention, I am a substitute for so-and-so, I'm a substitute for so-and-so. And that's why I didn't. That's how I got into the Army. And that's why I never collected bounty money or something. But he said anyways, they said sometimes in the service record, a soldier will mention that he's a substitute for someone else. Sometimes in his pension, he or his widow will mention that he was a substitute. By the way, in the case of Theodore Roosevelt, his mother's family were from Roswell, Georgia, and his father said he did not want to serve in the Army, so he hired a substitute because he said he was afraid he might be killed or kill some of his in-laws.
Now, how would somebody who did not want to serve and wanted a substitute, how would they find a substitute? Did they run an ad in the newspaper, or was there some sort of a clearinghouse?
Yes, there was an ad in the newspaper. Also, you could ask around. There were always people. There was always young men who missed the draft who were willing to take your place. It was a big business. Sometimes you would offer them, say, well, if you enlist, you can keep the bounty money, or I'm being drafted, here's however much money. Anyway, it was simply a business transaction that you negotiated. And sometimes you could ask your neighbors or your family. You could find someone. Often you could find a nephew or someone who would go in your place. But yes, they did run advertisements in the newspaper.
Okay, great. Okay, now Marlene is asking, when I started looking for my Civil War ancestor, there was a problem between where the records were located and who had custody of the records, the Library of Congress or the Veterans Administration. Since both of my ancestors died after 1903, their records were in the Library of Congress, but you had to get them from the Veterans Administration. And the VA doesn't know that. It took me 22 months to get the first set and 25 months to get the second. And the only help with I had to go to get help through my congresswoman. I think the death date has changed to after 1917, but beware.
Yeah, that would be about right. Now, I don't exactly understand what happened. I'm not aware of any veterans records at the Library of Congress. I am familiar that there are records you would think are at the National Archives, but are actually still at the Veterans Administration. Now, if your ancestor was a Civil War pensioner and he lived so long that the Veterans Administration was created, his federal Civil War pension was transferred to the Veterans Administration. And you have to go to the Veterans Administration to get his pension file. And the Veterans Administration would prefer that you didn't, but they have to, you get a real runaround with the Veterans Administration before somebody finally gets off their rear end and helps you on that. But those files will be in St. Louis, and you can ask for them through your local Veterans Administration. I recommend sending a ordinary letter to the Veterans Administration. Get the address from the National Archives from the Veterans Administration website, write to your state Veterans Administration office or to the national one, wherever, explain your situation, etc. Now, what you need to do is go to the index to federal Civil War pensions, the one that's on Ancestry.com or is also on Fold 3. You will actually see your ancestor's pension card. And that was shown in our PowerPoint display. Make a copy of that card. And when you make a copy of that card, send the copy to the Veterans Administration with your request. Now, the federal pensions that end up with the Veterans Administration, they will begin with the letter X, or they will begin with the letter C, or the letters XC. And that means the pension file is not at the National Archives. It is still with the Veterans Administration. Now, if your question is, why are these Civil War pensions and Indian Wars pensions still with the Veterans Administration? I have no idea. And I've been asking that question for years, and I get no straight answer. If ever by some terrible mistake I end up President of the United States, that's going to be the first job I'm going to give to the head of the VA. Find all those old pensions and turn them over to the National Archives so we can all use them. It's not a matter of privacy. These people have been dead longer than Murphy's cat. But anyway, most of the time I go through all of this, the Veterans Administration can't find the pension.
Alas. Okay, as a follow-up question to that, when was the Veterans Administration created?
I do not know off the top of my head, but it's easy to find by Googling it.
Yeah, it kind of, didn't it morph out of the GAR?
No, it morphed out of the War Department. The War Department originally paid for all the pensions and things of this sort, and it had a whole special branch of the War Department that handled nothing but pensions, and it even had an office that served as an archive to supply the records for the pension investigations. Anyway, when the Veterans Administration is done, they just take all this out of the War Department and turn it over to the VA. In fact, I'm sure some people didn't even change offices. They just hung a new sign on the door. But this came about in the early, I know it came about in the early 1900s. In the early 1900s. Possibly because of the First World War.
Sherry is asking, where is the best place to look for a soldier's photo?
That can be very difficult. There are entire books published of Civil War photographs. I would start at the local public library. I would start within the family. But you just never know when where and when a Civil War photograph is going to turn up. One of the most often published photographs of the Civil War is a photograph of a black escaped slave named Hubbard Pryor. And in the first photograph, he's in his rags. And in the second photograph, he's in his uniform in the 44th United States Colored Infantry, Georgia. That photograph's been reproduced so many times. I did an article on him and the photographs for Prologue, the Quarterly of the National Archives. But there is no national catalog of Civil War photographs, unfortunately. The Library of Congress has many of them. Sometimes if you Google the name of the regiment, you will find somebody who is doing research on the regiment. And if you are luckier than anybody should be, they may know someone who has a photograph, What I'm trying to say is it's a very hard task to set up for. But you just never know. I had a cousin who wanted her ancestor's Confederate pension. He was the brother of my ancestor. And so I went to the Georgia Archives to get the Confederate pension. There was no pension file on this guy, and I tore the Georgia Archives apart looking for it. So I wrote back to her about my failure, and she wrote back and said, he had to have gotten a Confederate pension from the state of Georgia. I've got some of his paperwork. And she sent me the paperwork, and it says across the top, United States Pension Office. And I said, he got a federal pension because he's a Union soldier. And she said, that might explain the photograph. And she sent me what is the only photograph of a Georgian in the United States Army during the Civil War. And it's been reproduced several times since.
Wow, that's amazing. You mentioned, excuse me, you mentioned about the investigators that were investigating fraud. Are there any books that kind of piqued my interest? I love reading books on the Civil War. Are there any books on the investigators or the investigators' results?
There have been articles and there have been references in broader books, like my book, Ghosts and Shadows of Andersonville. I talk about one of the strangest cases that come out of that. That was this Frenchman who was born in Indonesia or somewhere. He's in the United States when the Civil War begins. He joins a French regiment in the Union Army. But then when he thinks France is going to join the Confederacy, he's afraid he's going to be captured and shot as a French deserter. So he deserts from the Union Army and then re-enlists under a non-French name. Well, his battalion didn't want everybody thinking they were deserters and cowards, so they persuaded someone else to enlist to take his place in the battalion under his name. And that guy ends up dying at Andersonville. And so when the old Frenchman who served honorably in the U.S. Army applies for a pension, they discovered that there are 3 people under his name who are applying for his pension, 2 of whom are widows. And and also there were 3 other women applying under this guy's real name, as this goes. And anyway, the strangest case of this was a man named Newby. He's discussed in my book too. He was also an article by someone else in Prologue, the Quarterly of the National Archives. This Civil War widow believed that her husband had died at Andersonville. He was a Tennessee soldier in the Union Army. Then this crazy person comes to town, this guy whose mind is just about gone, and she is convinced that he is her husband, and that somehow he survived Andersonville. And it is obvious that he was at Andersonville. Yeah. And so this leads to this huge court trial where she's willing to give up her federal widow's pension to claim him as her husband. And they had like 137 witnesses. Some said, yes, this is Newby. And then there were others who said, no, this is Crazy Jack. And I remember him at Andersonville. He was so insane he survived Andersonville as a result. In the end, the court ruled that he was not Newby. And she refused to reapply for her federal pension because she said her husband was still alive. And oddly enough, this poor old crazy guy ends up dying in a mental institution near Andersonville, of all places.
What a story!
But there are many of these stories. And if somebody's looking for their next great nonfiction book or their dissertation or something, I recommend going through these pensions for stories like this of false identity. There was even one case I ran into where 2 women were claiming the same soldier, and the only way the pension office knew this was that the 2 pension attorneys, one for each woman, were working at the same desk, and they realized they were working on the same soldier, and so they went and spoke to the pension office and said, there's fraud going on here somewhere, somehow, in this. But as I say,
a fascinating book. The pension, the investigations. I think that would be like a really interesting book. Oh, we got a question here. Did the Pinkerton Agency do any military investigations?
Oh, did they ever? The Pinkerton Detective Agency had been around since 1850. They were originally they were the first real Secret Service. I mean, not Secret Service, but CIA, or FBI, or whatever you want to call it, of the United States. But they did investigations for Abraham Lincoln. They did investigations for General McClellan. They gave McClellan accurate information, but McClellan didn't want to believe it. So he went on his imagination instead of what the Pinkertons told him. Eventually, the Pinkertons are let go, and the United States forms its own intelligence agency under Sharp and Baker, Lafayette Baker. And they do a fairly good job of intelligence work in Washington, except they didn't have a clue about John Wilkes Booth and his conspirators until Lincoln was dead, which I guess is a black mark against them. But the Pinkertons did a lot of work during the Civil War. There's several good books that have been done on them, many of them written by Allen Pinkerton himself, though Pinkerton could, shall we say, exaggerate a bit now and then. And he also used women operatives. And there's a really good book on the Pinkerton women that's just come out. It's called The Pinks. That's what a woman operative for the Pinkerton Detective Agency was called. And they had fascinating stories and lives, including during the Civil War. One of the North's greatest spies was a woman named Hattie Lawton, and she was a Pinkerton operative.
That sounds like a great read. I have one last question, unless the class, because right now that's the end of the questions from the class. So I'll ask the class one last time. If you have any questions, please put it in the chat box. But while you're doing that or considering doing that, you mentioned the books by Beers. I assume that these books are out of copyright. Are these books available like at Internet Archive or at Google Books?
Because both of those books were published by the National Archives, they are probably available even in electronic form from the National Archives website. And there's only like 1 million copies of each of them out there. And so they would not be expensive to get slightly used copies of them or something. But the books are just wonderful. I've got a list of people I could have met, I wish I had met in my research travels. Henry Pudney Beers is high on that list. What he did on the Civil War was excellent. He also did an excellent guide to French and Spanish archives of Louisiana after he retired.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. You know what? I will look on those because I do the collection development for our genealogy section in our library, and I will do some searching and see if I can't find some of those books. So, okay, well, it looks like that's the last of the questions from the class. So, Robert, I am going to say thank you very, very much. And once again, I'm going to encourage the class to please reach out to you and, subscribe to your wonderful newsletter. Like I said, I've been enjoying it for years. And since the class cannot clap like they would if you had been here in person, or been here remotely in the classroom where we can see and hear you, they would have given you big hands. So I'm seeing on the chat room here, people are virtually clapping. So a lot of people saying thank you, thank you, thank you, clap, clap, clap. So I'm going to say thank you very, very much for your time. And once again, thank you for allowing us to record this session as well. Would it be okay if I share the PowerPoint presentation with my class as well?
Oh, absolutely. And even make paper copies for anyone who wants a paper copy.
Wonderful. I do a weekly email list, usually early the following week from the presentation, and all that will go out to my class probably around Monday or Tuesday of next week. So with that, all you'll have to do to end the session is click on the red hang up button. And if there's anybody in the class who would like to have some one-on-one research help after we all hang up, I will stay online until 2 o'clock. And if everybody logs out, I'll assume nobody needs help, and I'll go ahead and close out the webinar. So with that, once again, Robert, thank you so much for your time. It was wonderful, and it is deeply appreciated by my students.